Good day, everyone. Hope you're all doing fine today. Beautiful day in Portland, and here I am sitting out in the sunshine making a video. Today I would like to talk about something in particular, which is stereotypes, judgments. I've spoken a lot about that, but stereotypes in particular today, I become inspired in my videos. I don't even really have a subject, and something I run across in my daily life will inspire me to want to make a video. And today it was Scooby-Doo. My son was in there watching a Scooby-Doo cartoon, and in the cartoon there was an art gallery, and they had an art show going on, and I didn't know that it was an art show. All I did was I looked up at the TV and I saw this band playing, and they had these weird futuristic clothes on, and they were playing one of those like keyboard/guitar things, and just playing this weird spacey music. I'm like, what is this? And then it panned out to the gallery, and I was like, oh, it's an art show. And one of the characters in there was called Andy. It was not Andy Warhol, but it was based on the character. It was like Andy Warbuck or something like that. Something to imply that it was based on that type of art. And the characters in the cartoon were very how do I put this without sounding condescending or judgmental, but very snobbish, stuck up. They all had their funky weird clothes on, turtlenecks, weird glasses, funky haircuts, and this very snooty attitude towards the art and the people who didn't understand the art. And instantly I thought about that stereotype that is always put. I've seen this in several shows and several books. The way people write about things, the people write about artists, the way people talk about artists, is that there's a class of artists that are some of the either the very eccentric or the very I don't know the proper lingo because I'm not an artist in that form, but in the past I've had debates with artists about what is art, what constitutes art, and there's a certain class of artists who believe that art has to contain a certain format or system, and that it has to move them in a certain way to where it represents what that art type is, if that makes sense. And anybody who makes art outside of that is not an artist, and they tend to have this snooty look towards people who think that art is just painting a picture from your heart. First off, let me start by defining my definition of art. Art to me is anything that is created through the emotion or feeling of an individual that moves someone to think, whether it be just the individual or other people. Something that they look at and think and can see that a person put their love into that. And you could draw a line by saying, that there are hobbies and crafts and separate that from art. I don't, but I understand that the word art in definition, particular types of art, means paintings. But anyway, getting too far off subject, those particular folks who are, into that kind of art tend to be judgmental towards others who aren't in their class or group. And when I thought about that, I thought, is that a stereotype judgment? Is that something that pertains or is legitimate to society? And what about all the other labels that we put on people, not just artists? That was just my example, but ever since I started trying to understand tolerance and embracing everyone for who they are, I've had to go through a complete re-understanding of people in general and say, how much can I take? And sometimes we stereotype entire groups of people. A good example, I guess, would be racial profiling, which people will argue by saying, oh, well, blacks are more likely to get arrested, or blacks are more likely to get themselves in trouble, which statistically on paper may seem to be true. But the reality is that we know that if you look deeper, many of the inner cities are populated by blacks, and they are profiled, so therefore they're more likely to be arrested, and they're more likely to be imprisoned. This is just a fact. This is a fact of the way our society runs. We're still racist. But how much of that profile of black people is correct? Well, what about white people? being profiled against as well by blacks. The whole dual racism thing going on. And it's a totally separate issue, but beyond race, how about profiling someone or stereotyping a group based on political values? Or what about stereotyping a group based on religion? A good example would be stereotyping Christians. It's something I try really hard not to do. It's something I used to do when I was younger, but in my years of speaking with a lot of Christians, I realized that what one person deems to be a Christian is not the same as another. So therefore, there are very tolerant Christians and very intolerant Christians. So by stereotyping them as a whole, what good does that do? Anything? Because you have to ask ourselves, if 80% or 90% of any particular group is, let's say, negative, or, oh, that's weird. If 80 or 90% of a group tends to lean towards the stereotype that we place on them, but the other, say, 10% doesn't, or the other 20% doesn't, is that stereotype a viable way to protect ourselves from being harmed? If I could come up with an example, and give me a second here, I guess my example would be, let's see, gangsters, or people who dress like gangsters, okay? You're walking down the street and you see a group of gangsters walking down the street, okay? Regardless of whether or not they're just wannabes or posers or they're hardcore killers, you don't know. All you know is that you're stereotyping and judging them based on what they're wearing. We know that there are probably a large percentage of gangsters who are harmless, who just want to be part of a group and who will probably leave the gang, might never harm anyone, but a majority of them will probably do what they can to fit into the group and to make themselves, I guess, more of a gangster. I'm trying to put this as easily as I can. So, is it a valid thing to stereotype the gangsters you see walking down the street? Even though they may be one of the 10% that won't hurt you, or wouldn't even think about robbing you. I mean, we're talking about a dark alley in the middle of the night, you know. What if they're one of the 80 and 90%? These are the questions that keep me thinking and thinking and thinking about whether or not judgment is a valid path to protect ourselves, or whether it has any real virtue in it. Is it a virtue to judge a person? Because I know that that's very strongly frowned upon, and that's why it's such an issue to me, is because many of the new, the ways of thinking are to be non-judgmental and to never judge another, and or lest ye be judged kind of stuff, and which is true. But let's think about it this way: you judge another based on the things that they're doing wrong, and another judges you based on the things that you're doing right. See, judgment doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing, see? And so I guess the reason why you wouldn't want to judge a person for being a certain way is if you are a certain way, that you wouldn't want others to judge you for being. But let's say that you're being the best person that you can, and you judge another for not trying or putting forth any effort, a person who's harming the society, is that okay? Or do we just keep our mouths shut when other people do things wrong, Some folks say to just let it be and let others, be the way they are, and as long as it harms no other, then don't judge, which I would agree with. But there are degrees where it does harm others. But then sometimes there's the very mundane aspects of it, like I was saying about art. Like, sure, you're going to stereotype a person based on the clothes that they wear. This is something I've been trying to convey for so long without sounding arrogant, is that it's not about the way a person dresses. It's about what's behind the motivation for dressing that way. When we judge hippies, I've always been judged with the hippies as because I grew up, in the 90s, and I did this 80s and 90s. I went through that whole hippie generation, the second hippie movement thing, and I had my hair long and tie-dyes and everything, and I didn't I got judged so many times by people, dirty hippie, smelly hippie, hippies don't take showers, and I'd always be offended by that kind of stuff. But after going to enough dead shows and hanging out with these people, I realized that stereotype was correct. It's a majority of the time it's correct. A lot of people don't take baths. A lot of these hippies, they would pride themselves on how dirty they could get, how nappy their dreadlocks could get. I know that sounds silly, but anybody who's been in the inner circles with family, real family, the family, not your family, but the family, if you know what I'm talking about, these people would almost compete for how dirty they could be. And it sounds silly. It wasn't a literal thing. It was just like, look at me, I'm wearing the grungiest clothes I can. I got the nappiest hair, therefore I'm most in touch with my spirit. So that stereotype was kind of correct to an extent. And I think a lot of the other ones are too. So all I'm really trying to say here is to not cast judgment or stereotype out as something negative, but rather a tool to help us understand groups of people and how they operate. Because the best we can do is to protect ourselves through knowing others and knowing a little bit about what makes people tick. I think goes a long way in understanding ourselves and our own motivation. So, namaste, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening.